On today's show, an emergency edition of the podcast with a bombshell report coming out from Charania and Amick over at The Athletic, talking about Trae Young, McMillan, the story behind Trae not being in the building on Friday. We'll cover all of that and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1362 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening, December 4th. And I thank you, as always, for joining us on the Locked On Hawks podcast, making us your first listen each and every day. Check out the podcast across platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Odyssey, and YouTube on the video side. Today's show will be sort of an emergency edition of the podcast, talking about the bombshell reporting on Sunday afternoon from Shams Charania, as well as Amick of The Athletic. Plenty of detail in there, and then we'll get into my own thoughts on what's transpiring. And at the end of the podcast, a little bit of a Hawks Thunder preview, as the Hawks do return to action on Monday evening at State Farm Arena. I will be in the building for that game. If you're a long-time listener, you may know this, I should say. But if you're not, I don't love talking about the tea, as they say. I like to talk about basketball on this podcast, but anytime there is a national level report that involves some strife behind the scenes with the best player on a team, a superstar player, and its head coach, it becomes national news. The Hawks are not always covered nationally in the way that we might all prefer locally, because there's not always the attention paid and the detail paid to the Hawks, in my opinion. But this is the time of year and the type of story that gets to that national level, and plenty to get to on what probably is going to be a little bit of a shorter episode of the podcast, but still a pretty emergency level, siren level podcast on this Sunday evening. All right, so we'll start from Friday to give you the full context here. The Hawks had multiple players on the injury report. They were added after shoot-around on Monday morning. Pretty normal circumstances in some ways, headlined by Trey Young, who was added to the injury report as questionable with shoulder soreness on midday on Friday. By now, if you're a Hawks fan or listening to this podcast, you probably know that Trey did not play in the game on Friday, which the Hawks ended up winning in pretty impressive fashion while they were very shorthanded and beating a very solid team in the Denver Nuggets. I talked about that show, by the way, in full on the podcast on Friday. So if you want to listen to that podcast, I definitely encourage you to talk about that, to sort of dive into that one on the basketball side, and please subscribe to the show. But during the game, I think I was the first person to report this. Trey Young was not in the building at all on Friday, which people were kind of noticing he was on the bench, and I did some reporting. I'm not always a newsbreaker, but I'm pretty sure I was the first person to say he was not in the building on Friday. And that's pretty strange for a player, particularly one of Trey's status, to not be in the building for a home game in the middle of a homestand, a multi-game homestand, when they were not. It was not illness. Trey Young was on the injury report with an injury, and not one that would have kept him off of the bench. So he had been a shoot-around earlier that day, by all accounts, and all that fun stuff. So it was definitely a little bit odd. I didn't think of it as like a siren little situation at that point, but it was noticeable that he wasn't there, which led me to kind of find out that he was not in the building at all. And there you go. Now, fast forward to Sunday. About 40 hours later or so, Laura Williams of the AJC asked McMillan about Trey not being at the game on Friday. And McMillan referred to a, quote, miscommunication, end quote. Gave no other details. I've heard the audio for this. The audio quality is terrible because it's during practice today. So I'm not going to play it for you because it's basically unintelligible. But just trust me when I say Nate basically said nothing other than the fact that it was miscommunication. And Nate is very good at kind of stonewalling, and that was definitely what happened in that case. I think he used that word multiple times in the answer that he gave to Lauren. 4 or 5 hours after that, on Sunday afternoon, Shams and Amick releases the report in conjunction with everything at the Athletic and all their resources, and it's trying to let on what happened behind the scenes. I'll say this now. This is reporting. This is not the Hawks did not announce this. I have not witnessed this, so I'm going to attribute them. These guys are very credible reporters, so I'm going to assume that this is correct on some level. But at the same time, it's not documented or released by the Hawks. All that fun stuff. All those caveats definitely apply. The first part of the report was that Trey Young was having treatment on his shoulder, and Nate McMillan asked him, reportedly, if he's going to go through shoot-around, have treatment, and then play in the game on Friday. Trey reportedly said, and by the way, I definitely encourage you to read the entire piece. The Athletic is definitely something that you should be subscribing to, in my opinion. I have not paid to endorse them by any means, but it is very valuable for me to dive in beyond the Hawks and just the entire NBA landscape. But I definitely always encourage people to read the actual reporting in the way that it was written. Anyway, Trey reportedly said that he wanted to focus on his treatment during the shoot around and not participate, and then and see later in the day if he could play in the game on Friday. Nate did not endorse that approach, reportedly, and seemingly gave Trae two options. Basically, in a way that Shams wrote it, was that one of them was to come off the bench for the game or don't come to the arena at all. And Young, obviously, of those two choices, reportedly chose the option not to play and did not come to the arena at all. He was tweeting during the game, so I think he was watching the game. That's one of those things, like, I was curious to see, once I was told that he was not there, would he be kind of active? Because, Trae is definitely on social media and likes to say things. He was tweeting during the game, encouragement, all kinds of, it was all positive about the Hawks, etc. But that's at least notable because guys cannot tweet on the bench. If you're on the bench, you can't have your phone. So that was one dead giveaway that he was not really close to the team at that point in time. Anyway, and for the record, Young does have an actual injury by all accounts. Now, I don't know how serious it is, and he's not on the injury report for Monday's game, so it's probably not that serious. But I was told that it's been bothering him for about a week at this point, the shoulder, and he was getting treatment on it when this alleged incident happened on Friday. So it's some sort of injury for Trae, at least some sort of ailment. Also, I will say this, Hawks Fan TV had a tweet over the weekend about a, quote, heated argument between a player and McMillan. So they were onto something there. They didn't mention Trae or any of the details, but they were that was sort of making the rounds, and definitely people asking me about that. I had not heard it, but at the same time, like, obviously something happened there, so kudos to them for having that ahead of time. Trey Young then went through practice on Sunday, which happened, of course, early today as I'm recording this, and he's going to be playing Monday. He's not on the injury report at all. By all accounts, he's going to play, and Shams reports that he has no disciplinary action is happening for Trae at this point. I heard the same and tried to poke around a little bit today. So nothing from the team, no suspension, any of that stuff. This is supposed to be, all is well at this point in time. Now, in zooming out a little bit here, and I'm going to have more of my own thoughts in a second, the framing behind what was written by Shams and Amick paints a pretty ugly picture, honestly, overall. Now, if you've been following this team for a while, there was a flood of this kind of reporting during the end of the Lloyd Pierce era. There was a little bit of a spat write-up from Chris Kirchner about John Collins and Trey Young in a film session. These kind of things range from serious to not serious in my mind, from what I can gather. This is one that's not quite on the full-on five-alarm fire, but it's not good, to be sure, to have a player of Trey Young's stature and a head coach reportedly in this kind of situation. Now, the piece led by saying, quote, the team is managing simmering issues between its head coach and star player, end quote. That on its own is not great from a national standpoint. Now, they also wrote about a, quote, microcosm of tension in the locker room and reported, quote, multiple team meetings early this season to resolve various conflicts, end quote. Now, what I can gather, I don't think it's necessarily been like a full-on team meeting all the time. The Hawks are also like playing decently well. They're not playing great necessarily, but I will just say, imagine if they were 9-14 and not 13-10 at this point. At least they are winning. They are actually fourth in the East right now, which is kind of funny when you think about all the way that this team has been talked about in the recent past about the offense and all that stuff. They're 13-10 right now and actually winning more than they lose. Now, the last thing that I will say from their piece is that they wrote that it is, quote, the latest sensitive situation that has caused many people within the Hawks to question Young's leadership approach, end quote. Now, that's notable. Obviously, it does not name people. Within the Hawks can be anything, could be anybody in the organization. But, that's definitely notable that, the best player, the face of the franchise, would have those kind of criticisms or at least, critiques laid out publicly in a national outlet like this. Trae, I will say, has never been known as the most vocal leader. He's definitely more of a lead by example guy, and I think he's thrust into a leadership role because he is the best player. He's not a natural, vocal, galvanizing leader. That's kind of that's not even me criticizing. I think that's just the reality of the situation. There was reporting a couple of years ago when the Hawks were having some leadership challenges. They didn't have a whole lot of voice in the locker room. Trae was on that team, was the best player on that team, etc. I don't think that if you just look at even Trae's personality publicly. I've talked to Trae, more than people have, generally speaking, but he's not the most boisterous. He's not the most leadership guy in terms of what he says. I'm not saying he's a bad leader, but he's not known for that either. So that's kind of part of the calculus here as well. But the fact that, again, many people within the Hawks are questioning reportedly his leadership approach, that's not necessarily great. And the last thing here that I will say is that in the piece, executives are across the league, this is a quote from Shams, executives across the league who have heard about the Hawks behind the scenes issues wonder what this means for the future of Nate McMillan. Shams did report that Nate is safe right now, given the team is, again, in fourth place. I think if the Hawks had lost the last couple games, if they had lost in Orlando and had lost 5 in a row, maybe you get the alarm bells on Nate. But at 13-10, something crazy would have to happen to get a coach fired in fourth place, especially a guy with 2.5 years left in his contract. He's in year 2 of a 4-year deal. That is definitely part of this as well. I know a lot of the deals for coaches are basically 4-year -1, so it could be a team option on year 4. I don't actually know that for sure, but it's a 4-year deal for sure, and this is year 2 of that 4-year deal. So you have to pay out some money if you're going to find Nate McMillan right now. And also, unlike what happened with Lloyd Pierce, they don't have Nate McMillan to go to on this bench. They have Joe Prunty, who is a former head coach, but not necessarily someone who's seen as a future head coach in the league. They have some guys who, Mike Longobardi has been kind of an elevated assistant coach. They don't have that very obvious guy to turn it over to in the middle of the season either, which is at least part of the conversation. So I'm going to talk about what I make of all of this in a minute, but I wanted to at least lay out what was reported, what was said and written by Shams, what was noted by Sam Amick, etc. And just to say, as a tease for what will happen in a second when I talk about more of this, this is not good. I don't think it's a 10 out of 10, like tear down the walls kind of issue right now, but I don't think that this is a good situation to be in a quarter of the season. That goes without saying on some level, but for this to get out in the way that it did, and for just like the situation to happen how it did, is definitely not a positive for the state of the Hawks in the present. All right, I'll have more on this in a moment, but first, a word from our sponsors on the show today. Today's show is brought to you by Turo. Turo is the world's largest car-sharing marketplace, and with Turo, you can book any car you want wherever you want it from a community of local hosts. Browse a huge selection of vehicles just about any occasion or budget across the U.S., the UK, Canada, and coming soon to Australia, and book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip, or if you want to, get a classic or luxury car for a special event, a birthday, or a holiday, or find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget. Just want to get from point A to point B. Test drive that new electric vehicle as well if you have your eye on that to see how it fits in your everyday life. And many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. Today's show is also brought to you by BetOnline, and December is here, and the NBA season is in full swing with plenty of football, hockey, and other action going on in the sports world. Of course, bowl season is approaching, football playoffs, all that fun stuff. And BetOnline is the number one source for wager information you're looking for, and that includes stats, news, and analysis this season. Get the latest odds and trends for every pro and college league out there at BetOnline. That includes the latest in football and basketball and soccer with the World Cup still ongoing, esports, golf, tennis, auto racing, horse racing, and many more. BetOnline is also very useful, engaging the latest on the Hawks, from the nightly lines and totals and money lines, all that fun stuff, to futures markets, season win totals, conference odds, title odds, etc. Even the individual award stuff can be found at BetOnline. BetOnline is also the fastest and easiest way to get your sports betting fix. And if you love sports podcasts, you can also find those at BetOnline. Check out BetOnline on your mobile device or computer to learn more about all of the trends and the action in the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so as I said before the break, it's not great, obviously, is the big picture takeaway here. There was some buzz about Nate and Trey at the end of last season not being 100% on the same page. Nate, of course, flew to Oklahoma over the summer. There was talk about that. Both he and Trey acknowledged that. They spent some time together. Both sides were saying all the right things coming into the season. But now the season is going. The Hawks' win-loss record is not disastrous again by any means, but the offense is kind of a mess. I'm sure that's not helping things with regard to an offense-first superstar that, while Trey is still putting up counting stats, he's not having his best season in either individually. Efficiency is down. He's not necessarily mentioned on those All-NBA conversations at this point in the season. It's still very early, but no one's making a campaign for Trey to be a dark horse MVP candidate or even an All-NBA guy right now if the season ended today. So that's part of this as well. I said this before, but I don't think this is the best head coach superstar partnership that you would draw up in a lab necessarily. Nate is an old school guy. He does command respect, and that definitely worked for him beautifully 2 years ago. Famously, the team galvanized around Nate. Part of that was getting healthier and all that stuff too. But going from Lloyd to Nate in the middle of the season worked out great for the Hawks, obviously. But I can see those two not necessarily having the best relationship in the world personality-wise, because I know what I know about both those guys in general. Nate, not the most innovative coach tactically, making life difficult for a player like Trey at times. Trey has a reputation that, whether he's earned it or not, he's kind of had it for a while, even dating back to college, about being a little bit challenging to work with on some level. Whether that's true or not, like, I've never had to work with the guy, but none of us, and really none of us ever know. I'm very, very confident that without even checking my mentions, someone has called Trey Young a coach killer in the last couple of hours. I can guarantee that happened, either nationally or locally. Somebody said that. And look, that's just part of the deal when you're a prominent player, a superstar player. But None of us really know ever on this stuff. Not even like me, someone who's more plugged in than most. I'm never going to know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. But Shams, even writing some of those things about Trae, paints a picture about what's going on. And obviously, it did not go well with Lloyd at the end either. And I'm sure it was a two-way street. Even this incident, I'll just say this, like the way it was reported, it seems like kind of petty on both sides. Like, I'm not going to read the entire thing to you on the podcast, but like on Nate's side, it seems kind of petty to like give Trae an ultimatum about like you're going to come off the bench or go home kind of thing. That's not great on his side. On Trae's side, him kind of whatever it is, blowing it off and then not showing up to the game. That's not great either. So like, I'm not sure where to assign blame. It's probably two-way. It's probably the safest thing to say at this point. And look, these guys work together. And by the way, this is a spoiler maybe for some people on the outside. NBA players and coaches don't always get along. NBA players and players don't always get along, even on the same team. Now, there are levels of strife that you cannot get past, but a lot of stuff happens over the course of the season. Like if this didn't get out, would it have impacted the team moving forward? Maybe not. We'll see. But I generally think that some of the stuff gets overplayed, but I will say it's not good. So, and the reality of the NBA also is part of the job of a head coach, and you can argue about this on both sides, is getting along with a star player and making the star player happy because, like it or not, Trey Young has a lot more power organizationally than Nate McMillan does. That's just the reality. That's how it is in the NBA 95% of the time, maybe even higher than that. Is that the player, especially the star player, has more juice in the organization than the head coach does. Like maybe a situation like Greg Popovich or Eric Spoelstra or, pick whatever like Hall of Fame level coach, they have more than most. But even then, if you're the Warriors and your choices are backing Steph Curry or Steve Kerr, you're picking Steph Curry. If your choices in San Antonio in the 90s or the 2000s were to back Tim Duncan or Greg Popovich, you're choosing Tim Duncan. So it's like, and by the way, Nate McMillan is not Greg Popovich. He's not on that level of coach. And Trae is obviously the face of the franchise. He knows it. Everybody knows it. And that's part of that dynamic here, for better or worse. So coaches are always the first to go. We saw that with Lloyd. I think that, especially if you're in the front office, if you're ownership, one of the easiest things, quote unquote, that you can do to change up everything is to fire the coach. There is no salary cap. There is implications on a head coach. There are no luxury tax implications on a head coach. It's easier to do that than making sweeping changes to your roster. So I say all that to say, like, I know Hawks fans, a lot of Hawks fans that I've seen are not happy with Nate and want Nate gone. And, I get it on both sides. I've talked about Nate a lot on this podcast. I think Nate, I've said this for a long time. At one point, 2 years ago, and even last year, I think I was probably lower on Nate than the fan base was, because I think Nate is kind of the same guy he's always been. I think Nate McMillan is a middling coach, not a terrible coach, not a great coach. He's a guy who's been around for a long time, has a lot of wins, a lot of respect around the league. He's a guy who people like, but at the same time, he's not like a culture changer in terms of your schematics. Now, locker room stuff, he's pretty regarded as pretty good at that stuff. At the same time, Indiana, a couple of things didn't go super well behind the scenes. Brogdon famously didn't like him very much. Some of the guys in Indiana at the end did not go well. So there's always a next to play. I don't think that this is a full-on panic moment, but it is a reminder of a few things. Number one, Trae has a lot of power. Number two, if there is something that's going to happen between the two of them, Nate's going to be the one that's going to go. I'm pretty confident about that. And at the moment, like, I don't think we've reached the level where like Nate has to be fired or something has to happen. We'll see how Monday goes. We'll see if Trae speaks. By all accounts, Trae was out the door at practice today before the media was let in. So he was not able to speak to the media. I don't know if he'll talk on Monday, either at shoot around or before or after the game. We will see about that as well. Let's see what he has to say, how he sort of acknowledges this. But yeah, it's something that I think is rising to a keeping an eye on territory at this point. If I am the Hawks, if I am, people listening to this podcast, if I'm a Hawks fan, my advice would be to not like panic about this. But at the same time, it is something now that once this kind of story comes out, the lights get brighter on the situation, so that any public interaction between Nate and Trae that has like any weirdness to it on a court or even like in a huddle is going to get magnified. Anything that Nate says, anything Trae says is going to get magnified about this, and that can add more fuel to the fire as we go. So a weird one for sure, and prompted an emergency podcast. At the same time, it was definitely kind of a weird day, and we'll leave it there for now. Last thing before we get out of here on the podcast is a brief look ahead to the game on Monday because I'm already going to, I don't always do game previews, but I'm already here. It's Sunday night. The Hawks play on Monday, so a couple of news and notes things to hit on here. The injury report is much cleaner for the Hawks than it was on Friday. That's a positive. Only 4 guys are on the injury report at all, and they're already ruled out. So there's no drama on the injury report heading into Monday. John Collins and DeAndre Hunter are going to be out for a while longer. Those guys are out right now. Justin Holiday is still in the health and safety protocol. That is notable. Nate said he was not able to come back in practice today. I guess there's still a chance he could be clear. He could be cleared for Monday, but he is currently listed as out on the injury report. And then Trent Forrest is officially in concussion protocol. So he was being evaluated on Friday. Now he's in the protocol, and that's a tricky situation. You kind of have to test out of that. So those 4 guys are expected to be out in this game. That also means that in addition to Trae, Clint Capella, Wladimir Bogdanovic, Jalen Johnson, and Frank Kaminsky are all off the injury report entirely after they were questionable coming into Friday. So particularly with Capella and Bogey, that is very good news. Clint, they just have to have. He's so valuable to them. And then Bogey coming off of the debut on Friday, a step forward there. We'll see what his minutes look like. I wonder if Nate will answer questions about Bogey's workload in the future. But he played 22 minutes in the opener. He'd probably go up from there. But I don't think you'll be seeing him play starter minutes anytime soon. But another body, another shooter, and he will help very much in the absence of Hunter and Collins in particular. On the Thunder side, just briefly, they are 10-13. They actually won and put up 135 the other night in Minnesota. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is a star. He is playing fantastic basketball. He is an all-NBA guy as of right now this season, averaging 31 points a game. He is the number 1 guy to keep an eye on in this spot. And by the way, Oklahoma City leads the league in points in the paint, and part of that, or a lot of that, is Shai, who leads the league in drives and points off drives. So the Hawks have to stop the point of attack in this game. Having Trae back would I help that? I think that you'll probably see DeJounte on Shai quite a bit. You might see even like someone like Jarrett Culver, maybe even Aaron Holiday at some point. He's obviously a little bit smaller than you probably want on someone like Shai, but he's a tough matchup for anybody, and the Hawks don't really have a perfect guy to guard him. DeJounte is probably their best option, but I think it would have been Hunter, honestly, if he'd been around, but he's not going to be around in this game, so maybe you'll see a little bit of a kitchen sink approach to guarding Shai. Other thing for the Hawks here is to protect the ball. The Thunder lead the league in turnovers forced per game on defense. Fortunately, the Hawks are awesome at that, so that's something to keep an eye on, but that's one for the record books. On the last part of this is, as I kind of always say, the injury reports in addition to the spread. I'm looking right now in real time to give you the best possible spread on the game on Monday, but with the injury reports out and everything, there's still nothing that I've seen so far. I think the Hawks are going to be favored in the game. I've not seen a number just yet, but I'm fairly sure, unless something crazy happens, the Hawks will be favored at home, but nothing is a given. Like the Thunder are better than I thought they were going to be. They're 10-13. They are below average on offense and defense, barely, but they're not terrible either on the floor. I think Shai's carrying the offense for sure. They're also very well coached. The Hawks can definitely lose to the Thunder. This is a better team than you would think on paper. And they're also pretty healthy. Only Chet Holmgren, who's out for the season, basically, for Oklahoma City, is on the injury report. So they are the healthier team in this spot. And the Hawks, again, without Hunter and Collins, I know they won on Friday without those guys, but they are still worse without Collins and Hunter on the team. So we'll see how this all goes. And definitely a nice, interesting game on a Monday evening by all accounts. All right. That's it for this emergency podcast. I really appreciate everybody listening to the podcast. I want to plug a few things on the way out. Number one, please subscribe to this show across podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Odyssey app, all those places, as well as YouTube on the video side. If you are trying to support the podcast, the best possible way is to go ahead and subscribe and download across platforms. Put it on auto download, however you want to do that. Ratings and reviews are also very, very positive. And please follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Also, I am writing more often these days. I have launched a Patreon. It is patreon.com/BT Rowland. If you want to support, all the posts right now are still free, but I have a lot of patrons who I definitely thank quite a bit for sending me a little bit of money each month on that particular platform to get some support of the podcast, also support of everything that's going on my written content. I've been writing game previews and little things on that for the last few weeks, and it's been a lot of fun to get back into the swing of things on the writing side. So all that said, thank you for listening to the podcast, everybody. I really do appreciate it. I'll see everybody after the game on Monday evening.